everyone. My name is Mary Hartman, and I'm Director of Education at Bard on the Beach. Welcome to this third segment of our digital Bard Explored series. For more than a decade, we offered the Bard Explored series as part of our Shakespeare Festival. In an ordinary year, we might have performed 4 plays for about 100,000 people in a magnificent place called Snock on the waterfront in the heart of what we now call Vancouver. Snock has a rich, vibrant, and very long history as a place of gathering and storytelling. In an ordinary year, tonight would likely have been the closing night of our festival season. But of course, we're all in the midst of great adaptation. So instead of our usual gathering, we must gather in this virtual space. But we are still gathering, and that's a powerful thing. And we're all tuning in from somewhere. So I invite you to take a moment, wherever you are, to appreciate the history, culture, and spirit of that place and your connection to it. We at Bard on the Beach are on the lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the sponsors of Bard's 2021 season, the Peter and Joanne Brown Foundation and BMO. And I'd like to thank the sponsor of the Bard Explored series, the Office of the President of Simon Fraser University. I would like to say some things about your host for the Bard Explored series, and that's Dr. Paul Boudra. I imagine that many of you tuning in today are regulars with Bard Explored, and so you are no strangers to Paul and how delightful he is. But for anyone who's new, this is a collaboration that means a lot to me. Paul and I have been working together on the Bard Explored series, as I said, for more than a decade. Paul teaches Shakespeare and Renaissance literature at Simon Fraser University. He has also been the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences. He's the current head of SFU Publications. He has done fabulous writing and editing and publishing in his own right. And if you haven't heard his CBC, a recorded lecture on Shakespeare and conspiracy theories, look it up, it's really fantastic. But Paul is also wonderful on this Bard Explored series because when he lectures with great insight and wit. And in these conversations that we've been doing, he has shown tremendous curiosity and respect for our guests, and the conversations have been fantastic. So I will be back at the end to help with the Q&A, but now I'm delighted to turn it over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Mary. You always make me blush with these introductions. It's wonderful to be back. It's wonderful today to tell you about our guest, Dr. Farah Karim-Cooper. Now, Dr. Karim-Cooper completed her PhD at the University of London back in 2003. She is professor of Shakespeare Studies at King's College London, and she is the current president of the Shakespeare Association of America, the largest and most important scholarly society dedicated to the study of Shakespeare in the world. The annual conference of the SAA brings together some 1,400 Shakespeare scholars in one hotel for a, as you can imagine, wild weekend of bardolatry. Further, she is the head of higher education and research at Shakespeare's Globe, that amazing recreation of Shakespeare's theater on the bank of the Thames in London. She was the chair of the Globe Architecture Research Group that led to the construction of the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse. That's a recreation of an indoor 17th century theater entirely lit with candles that is now part of the Globe complex. She's published over 40 scholarly articles and several books, and let me just mention a few. Cosmetics in Shakespearean and Renaissance Drama. The Hand, like literally the hand, on the Shakespearean stage. And she's edited a book about Shakespeare's most gory play, Titus Andronicus. And she will be speaking to us today from her home in London. Farah, where are you? There you are. Welcome to Bard and the Beach, Farah.
Thank you so much. What a lovely introduction. Thank you.
Now, before turning to some big questions about Shakespeare. I was just wondering a little bit about your work as the head of higher education and research at Shakespeare's Globe. To me, this sounds like a dream job. But tell me exactly, what does that job entail? What do you do as the head of education at the Globe?
Well, essentially, I was the head of higher education and research, working in the education department, but now I'm co-director of the education department.
Okay.
So I kind of oversee with my colleague, Lucy Cuthbertson, the whole department's activities. And I work with the artistic director, Michelle Terry, on the creative programming board. So we create all the programming for Shakespeare's Globe together as an education and theater team. It's really exciting. But my job in the past was very much about, I suppose, heading up our higher education program. We kind of run a sort of mini university, and we work with loads of universities and drama schools, and we create bespoke courses for them. And we run an MA in Shakespeare Studies with King's College London. So I've been affiliated with King's for a very long time. And we run an acting program with the University of Rutgers Acting School, the Mason Gross School of Acting. And so that was one aspect of my role. The other aspect of my role was to oversee the research strategy and to make sure that scholars felt that they always had a home at Shakespeare's Globe. So it was trying to be sort of the go-between the artists and the scholars that were interested in the work that we were producing. So that's essentially what I've been doing for the last 17 years.
So I mean, it's got to be one of the few theaters in the world that is also in some way an educational institution.
I think so. And I think what's quite unique about it is that not many other theaters have a higher education program.
Yeah.
And that actually we have now 3 academics full-time employed at the Globe. So there's 3 doctors in the house, as it were.
Well, that's amazing. Before we go off the question of the Globe itself, so I understand that the Globe is turning 25 next year. Is that right? Yes.
Yeah,
Are there going to be special events that you can tell us about?
I hope so. I mean, we, as you know, like you guys, we've come through this pandemic, and we're kind of in what we're calling our recovery year. So we're trying very hard to be cautious about programming. We have a very ambitious vision for the future, but what we need to do right now is make sure that we can pull the Globe through this really difficult moment. Audiences are coming back in. But the audience confidence isn't quite where we need it to be in the theater landscape. So we're hoping that we have, we're going to put on a winter season in our indoor theater. So we're hoping that by the end of the year, we'll have a bit more confidence to be really ambitious about future programming.
Well, fingers crossed for you and for all the theater practitioners. And by the way, just to the people listening, if you have not had a chance yet to go to London and see a play performed in Shakespeare's Globe, do so tonight. Okay. Now, I'd like to come to a bigger question. This is a question I've been posing to all the guests in this series. Bard on the Beach produced a film called Done Undone, written by Kate Besworth, that explores a number of big questions around Shakespeare, and especially Shakespeare in the theater. And I guess the overarching question of the film is Shakespeare still relevant? Should we still be performing the plays of the archetypal dead white male some 450 years after his heyday, and playing them so often? And if we do perform them, how should we perform them? That's a big question. I think the Shakespeare's Globe, if any place in the world has had to wrestle with these questions, it's the Globe.
Yeah, that is a really big question. So Shakespeare, I think everybody who's here probably recognizes that Shakespeare speaks to so many experiences, and there's sort of a polyvocality to Shakespeare. So essentially, if you are trying to find yourself, you'll find yourself somewhere in one of these plays. I think Shakespeare's relevance is a really easy question for me. He is absolutely still relevant. His work is absolutely still relevant. We just did a production of Romeo and Juliet, and the production was it was quite conceptual, but it was thinking about it from the point of the mental health of adolescence, right? So we know that teen suicide is still a major issue in society. And the production really focused on that. And actually we got criticized for focusing on that too much and not telling the wonderful story of a wonderful love. And yes, there are extraordinary moments of expressions of love in this play. But at the end of the play, two young people take their own lives. And so our production really tried to engage with that and with the current moment when we know that after the pandemic and also the climate crisis and everything that's going on, that young people are in are in an anxious space at the moment. And so we really wanted to emphasize that. So that's just one example of how a work that was written 400 years ago can have such contemporary relevance. But in terms of how people think about Shakespeare, I feel like there's sort of two Shakespeares. There's the Shakespeare that was constructed in the 18th century, right? This sort of bardic figure who's placed on a plinth, and literally there were sculptures that were put up in England in the 18th century. And he was referred to as the Bard for the first time by David Garrick during the famous Jubilee in 1769. And this Shakespeare represented all that was brilliant about Britain. And there was a thing about how he should be performed, right? There was lots of debate at this time. And that Shakespeare is still with so many of us, so many people. And actually that Shakespeare feels like a barrier to the contemporary young person or to contemporary people today. And so the other Shakespeare is the Shakespeare that once you remove all of that construction of, I suppose, this sort of bardic myth of Shakespeare's universality and perfection, that underneath there are some stories. And those are the stories that people from all over the world translated Shakespeare, adapted Shakespeare, appropriated Shakespeare, retold the stories in their own traditions. That's the Shakespeare that I always want to get back to the heart to. And actually, I think what's so wonderful about that Shakespeare is that with all the joy that you get from that, you also get harm. So you have to confront some of the difficult questions and some of the, I suppose the questions around race and sexism, identity that we're still grappling with today. So that's the Shakespeare that actually we can put to work and the Shakespeare that's most useful to us.
No, that's really interesting. I like to come back to the questions of race and things, but let's go back to this, say, production of Romeo and Juliet.
Mm-hmm.
So you focused on the mental, just turmoil of these young kids that leads to suicides. And I understand the production came with trigger warnings.
Yes.
And then the British press jumped all over this.
And the conservative British press.
Yes, the conservative British press, which is there. And I have to think that the conservative British press is going to keep a special eye on Shakespeare's Globe, because this is somehow supposed to be, the resurrection of the traditional staging.
Yeah.
And what was their argument? What did you have to put up with?
Well, I think there's what we're calling a culture war in Britain, and I know that's going on in the U.S. and probably in Canada as well, where it kind of started, I suppose, in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. In this country, in Bristol, the statue of a slaver was basically dismantled and thrown into the river, and so it caused a huge amount of fear. Because that act symbolized a kind of, I suppose, decolonization, which to some people's ears sounds like destruction of history, and taking down our icons and canceling all the things that everybody felt safe having around them. But that's actually misinformation, right, when it comes to Shakespeare. I think what we've recognized is that, certainly with this production, that there is a mental health crisis in Britain at the moment. A lot of that has been largely due to the pandemic and the conditions that it's imposed on people's lives. Young people have been forced into lockdown. In Britain, we had really strict lockdowns for a very long time, and young people were isolated, and their education has been interrupted and disrupted. So this production wanted to speak to that identity at the moment, but also capture that there is this sort of liminal space that you are in as an adolescent. In Shakespeare's time, they didn't have the language or the science of adolescent brains, right? So they didn't know those phases. But now we do. But Shakespeare seems to have his finger on the pulse of those kinds of struggles and tensions that young people faced. And certainly young people who are in aristocratic families at that time who feel quite restricted. And, you know, for example, Juliet's, I suppose, the oppression that she was facing in her father's home, which is something that, you know, a lot of young women can still relate to in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So I guess what the production was trying to do was to say, actually, if you come and see this production, you might find that it disturbs you because right now there is a mental health crisis. So that's all it was trying to do. And actually it was objectifying the notion of a trigger warning. So the Globe doesn't have a policy of trigger warnings necessarily. We did trigger warnings when we did Titus Andronicus. It's a very violent play. It's very bloody. Yeah. And a lot of people fainted when we did that production. So the trigger warnings came, unfortunately, right after we realized that was happening. Yeah. But this is a very different time period now. So I think, you know, the press were kind of confusing it for a new policy. The Globe is trying to look after people, and actually what's wrong with young people being more robust? You know, we were all robust. Why can't you be robust? But that was kind of the argument.
Right. We smoke and drank and, you know, come on. You mentioned the question of race, and I understand you're working on a new book called The Great White Bard. And of course, this is one of the big issues with staging is Shakespeare's. What do you do with those elements that to us seem profoundly racist and profoundly sexist? And there are a number of strategies out there, and the Bard on the Beach has taken a number of strategies to deal with this, including and sometimes altering lines in the plays. So, I mean, what do you feel that we should be doing with that sort of material in Shakespeare?
Well, it's a really, really big question. I think, first of all, there are a lot of people who think that when you talk about Shakespeare and race, that you're being anachronistic. And so it shouldn't really, that conversation shouldn't happen. And talking about race in any context makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And yeah, it is a very uncomfortable topic, but sometimes discomfort is okay. Sometimes discomfort is required in order to achieve some sort of progress, right? So I suppose you have to think about the different sectors that you're dealing with. So we're talking about theater right now. Largely, theater in Britain is a white, what's referred to as a white space. It's a space that was designed for and by white people. And Shakespeare was a white Elizabethan English playwright. And so, but as we all know, that playwright spoke to several different experiences, and he has characters who are racially marked, and those characters speak about their identities. And so Shakespeare was not unaware of the tension, of racial tension. And that's why he centralized it. And actually, if you think about it, interracial marriage and interracial coupling happens a lot in Shakespeare. So if it's not explicitly in a play, sometimes it's referenced in another play. And there's a biracial baby in Shakespeare on stage. I mean, this is extraordinary for this time period. But actually, if you look back at that time period, you realize there were Black and brown people living in England, in Tudor England. Shakespeare may have encountered people of different races in his audience, but we've sort of segregated the archives, so we haven't done that proper research, and that proper research is now happening. So we're going to find out more about the kinds of encounters that Shakespeare might have had. But in terms of some of the lines in the plays that come across as rather racist or harmful, my advice has always been when you have actors of color in your cast and you're asking them to say these lines and you're a director, you have to have really open, safe conversations in the rehearsal room. And if the actors and the directors decide together that this line or these lines or this moment is not going to be productive to our storytelling because it's going to be harmful in this way or that way, then you omit those lines. And omitting lines from Shakespeare is something that's happened since Shakespeare was putting on Shakespeare, right?
Yeah.
So, it's not some sacred text, even though we've turned it into this sacred canonical thing, but it isn't sacred because these are performance scripts, essentially. So that, when an actor comes out on stage, a Black actor comes out on stage and has to say, "You Ethiop," the director needs to have dealt with that in the rehearsal room. Because if not, that's a harmful thing that can happen for that actor night after night.
What about productions that are, so-called, race blind, or gender blind, or disability blind? And I think of a specific production of Hamlet that I saw starring Michelle Terry at the Globe, where it was, we had a tall East Indian man playing Ophelia, for example. And what do you think of those sort of productions? Which, and remembering that the mandate for Shakespeare's Globe was to try to recreate the conditions of Shakespeare's theater, and then you have this. How do those things come together, and what do you think of it?
Well, it's interesting when you talk about, first, I think I'll address the question of the mandate for Shakespeare's Globe.
Okay.
So when Sam Wanamaker set out to rebuild the Globe, he was really interested in the architectural conditions. And we have lots of archival documents that talk about his fascination with the architecture and what that would produce or reproduce in terms of the meaning of the plays. When Mark Rylance took up the artistic directorship in 1997, or 1996, I think he started, he responded to this artistically. So he said, wait a minute, the building was built on the basis of craft, research, and materials. And that was the principle of building the Globe. So when he came along, he thought, maybe we should use those principles when performing in the space. And so that's where the idea of original practices came from. And they didn't do every single production original practices. They had modern dress productions. They had a production of Midsummer Night's Dream where everyone was wearing pajamas. But people forget. But the original practices production was an experiment of a group of artists who occupied the building in the first 10 years of the Globe. And what that entailed was recreating the clothing, the music. So we had early music, which was extraordinary. Early music performers being a regular thing in a theater was quite extraordinary for Britain. And then sort of aspects of play. Right. So how you play the stage. So there's things like movement, moving around the stage and not being too stationary, really responding to the architecture, direct address with the groundlings. That was all really important in terms of the principles of playing. But those original practices productions were created by a group of artists who occupied the Globe at a particular time. When Dominic Drumgoole came in 2006, he didn't want to do original practices because that wasn't his artistic means. So he created productions that were what he called Renaissance style. So you'd see doublet and hose and you'd hear some lute and you would still have early music, but it wasn't the scientifically reproduced costumes that we had under Mark Rylance's era. These productions were much cheaper to produce.
I imagine.
But then we also had a few modern dress productions, and he brought new plays in, and then we had a big intercultural festival with companies from around the world performing in their own languages.
I remember that.
So it was about kind of making Shakespeare more global and Shakespeare's Globe more global. And so that was his really fascinating and brilliant experiment. And now we have Michelle Terry. We had Emma Rice for a couple of years.
Briefly.
And she brought in technology, which did feel absolutely anti-Globe because it kind of masked the architecture and the conditions of playing. Okay. And so unfortunately that relationship didn't work out. But Michelle Terry's come in and her experiment is different. So she's come in very much thinking about modernity, she's thinking about how to keep the Globe in the 21st century. That question you asked me about Shakespeare's relevance also applies to the Globe, right? Because the Globe's been here 25 years now. So people who were not born are in their 20s, and the Globe feels like an old traditional thing. Whereas, when it was first built, it was seen as this radical theatrical experiment. So we need to keep it radical and a radical theatrical experiment. So that production of Hamlet that you're talking about was part of an experiment to create an ensemble. And what does ensemble mean? The Globe's never really had ensemble before. And it was looking at the sort of early concepts of acting in the 16th century, which were very much around the protean shape shifting that actors can do. You can occupy different bodies as an actor, and there are different techniques and ways of doing that. But it was not seen as an original practice under Michelle Terry, but it was just, let's see what happens if we have an ensemble. So we did that for a couple of years, and then that was put aside. And now there's a new ensemble coming up, which might have slightly different principles. But part of the, I suppose, development in casting at the Globe has been in relation to social justice and equity. So we know that there are very few parts for women in Shakespeare. We know that there's a couple of parts for actors of color in Shakespeare, and a part for a Jew in Shakespeare. So what does that mean for a contemporary stage, right? So, that was dealt with in the 20th century. So at the Globe, we tend not to think anymore about blind casting, colorblind or gender blind. We think about it as being a bit more conscious than that, right? So colorblind casting is something that can be really quite harmful for actors of color, because we're asking actors of color to erase their bodies and pretend that they're white. And we don't think about what the implications are for that. Whereas white actors are constantly privileged by that process. And so color conscious casting is as a director coming in and saying, I am going to cast a Black man as Henry V. And that director might decide that Henry V is going to be Black, or that there isn't going to be a racial element to the production at all, right? But they have to have that conversation and think really consciously about those parts. Also, Ayanna Thompson's, she did a book on colorblind casting back in 2006, and there hasn't been anything since then, so something needs to come out soon. Where she talks a lot about this idea of using racial logic, I suppose, when you're casting. So if you have families, maybe, if Polonius is in Hamlet is Black, maybe Ophelia and Laertes should be Black or mixed race, right? So that creates a sense of, okay, there is a racial marker here. There are racial identities in this play. And actually that can bring new meaning to a play. So I don't know if I've answered your question. I've just talked a lot about.
No, it's a big question. I don't think there are definitive answers. It's a continued source of experimentation, and it's really interesting that there's a new Macbeth movie starring Denzel Washington as Macbeth, and it's going to be fascinating to watch. When in the book that you're writing, The Great White Bard, are you going to be tackling some of these issues?
I am, yes.
Yeah.
The reason I wanted to write this book, it's a trade or commercial book, so it's not for academics. I've written quite a few academic books, and I wanted to, because I've always been a sort of public-facing academic working at the Globe through most of my career, even though I'm also a professor at King's. I wanted to write a book about this because in 2018, I ran a Shakespeare and Race Festival at the Globe and got a lot of questions from the public that we meet all the time around, what does Shakespeare have to do with race? Surely this is anachronistic. There were no Black people in Shakespeare's time. He probably wasn't, he has this play about a Moor, but he got that from a source, And so I thought, actually, there are such incredibly rigorous intellectual conversations going on in Shakespeare studies around pre-modern critical race theory and critical race studies, that it felt like that conversation isn't getting out into the public domain.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to write a book that would not really be an A to Z, but would sort of explain why Shakespeare needs to be decolonized to a certain extent, and to explain why race is a really live and urgent topic in Shakespeare, not just in his race plays, but in the plays that don't seem explicitly to be about race. And part of the project of the book is to explain that racial identity is not just in other identities, it's also whiteness is a racial identity as well. And the moment we acknowledge that, then that somehow takes some of the pressure off everyone else for being these raced other presences in Shakespeare and in the audiences and in our lives. So that's largely why I wanted to do it, is to tell the story of race, and so that people would approach festivals like this and ideas like this and maybe read some of the more academic studies of race that are out there and have been out there since the 70s, 80s, 90s, but have been marginalized because the mainstream of Shakespeare scholarship has not really wanted to tackle the question of racial identity.
Well, we look forward to that book. I think it's a great idea, especially the right one for a popular audience, because it's too often we academics just sit around and talk to each other. So we have to get out there. Now, this question of sort of, race comes down to the big question of appearance. And your first big book was in a way about appearance. It was about cosmetics and makeup. And I think it's such an interesting book and such an interesting topic. I think people would like to know a little bit about that. What was we'll start with for makeup for women at that time. What was the ideal for feminine beauty in Shakespeare's time? And do we see that in Shakespeare, or do we see it critiqued in Shakespeare?
That's a really good question. So, yeah, I mean, this book was, it was a response to so many things: the beauty standard and the pressure that it puts on women timelessly, from Cleopatra all the way to now. The beauty standard in Shakespeare's time was inherited largely from classical ideas and ideals of beauty. So things like symmetry, proportion, chromatic harmony, those came from classical texts, right? So those ideals applied not just to human beauty, but also to architecture and to art and various other domains. But in Shakespeare's time, and prior to that, in the medieval period, there is this sort of almost fetishism for pale, luminous skin. So it's not enough just to be white. You've got to be white with a kind of glow. And we still have that glow. I don't know, sometimes you find in makeup, there's sort of like glitter so that you look like you're glowing at night a little bit. So this was very, very popular in this period. And it kind of stemmed from this idea of the beauty treatises that came out in Italy and France and in England that expected women to look perfect, to look virtuous, but to do so naturally, right? So cosmetics were not really welcome in that process, but there is this kind of, okay, I won't say anything about the fact that you might have to wear makeup in order to look this way, right?
Right.
But the beauty standard at that time is you've got to be pale, you've got to be luminous, glowing, usually blonde or golden hair, as they describe it in a lot of poetry, ruby lips. In the 16th century, for a period of time, a very high forehead was considered attractive. And then and it just depends on the decade, and it depends on the continent and the country where you are.
Right.
But that's pretty much the standard of the time. And what Shakespeare does with this is he plays with it a lot. You might find in his work, in his contemporaries' work, there are really detailed descriptions of the perfect woman, right? You see that in the sonnets of Edmund Spenser or Philip Sidney, various other sonneteers. When you get to Shakespeare, he does a very different thing with his sonnets. His sonnets is probably a whole other topic that you probably want to do. But nowhere in Shakespeare does he give you a detailed description of the perfect woman. He just doesn't do it. He might say this woman's really beautiful, or I've got, when Helena says, well, I'm blonde and pale and tall. Why isn't anybody looking at me? That's the beauty standard. Hermia is short and dark.
Right.
So Shakespeare kind of twists it on its head, turns it on its head from time to time. And certainly the Dark Lady sonnets are about an alternative to the standard that was out there. And actually, he seems to find offensive that someone should tell him what's desirable and what's beautiful, right? And I will give the disclaimer that those Dark Lady sonnets are also point to a kind of promiscuity on the part of this Dark Lady, and that, a lot of race scholars talk about the misogynoir of that, this notion that women of color are more sexually lascivious than white women, and this is something that was around in the 16th century as well. So yeah, that's the beauty standard, and Shakespeare's take on that is often contrary.
When it comes, I mean, nowadays, if you want to learn about beauty tips, you go on TikTok and there's someone telling you how to shape your eyebrows. Obviously, anyway, but I'm thinking about there's makeup, the people in makeup, then there's theatrical makeup, and you have these boys having to look like that beauty standard.
Yes.
Right? How did they do it?
Well, it's really interesting. In the theaters of the time, they would have used the same materials that women used at home. If you were wealthy, you could get a very, very nice, what they call fucus, which is a combination of white lead and vinegar. And it has a kind of, if you can mix some pearl in it, crushed pearl, which would then give you a shimmering sort of complexion, right? It doesn't look anything like Kate Blanchett's Elizabeth. That was a little too white.
Yeah.
Right? It's a little, it has more of a pinkish glow to it.
Okay.
But in, the less wealthy would just be happy without the pearl, essentially, and they might use other kinds of things. And in Shakespeare's time, that the actors would have had that same sort of combination of ingredients. And, there was no pharmacy, no place you can go and get beauty products. So you had to go and get ingredients and then you'd make them. So we still don't have enough documentary evidence about how actors put makeup together, but we know that they wore makeup and they had makeup because there's so many stage directions calling for face painting, or a box of painting is brought on stage, and what all of that means. But boy actors, that's a really interesting question, because the beauty standard for women really kind of maps on to the beauty standard that was set for young men in the time. So if you read Venus and Adonis, Adonis is a young, vibrant male who Venus she desires him, but she's almost competing with him because their looks are very similar to each other, right? So these young boys are often in the literature, particularly the erotic poems of the time, are kind of sexualized in that way, but they're also feminized highly. And there's this really wonderful company that comes out of Shakespeare's current Stratford School. They're known as Edward's Boys, and they do a lot of early modern plays, and it's a company of young men. So I think they're probably between, I might get this wrong, but ages between 12 and 17 or 12 and 18. Wow. And it's directed by their drama teacher, Perry Mills, and they performed at the Globe a few times, and they perform early modern plays as a boy company. And what's really fascinating about it is when they've experimented with makeup, because they have such puerile faces, that they look very feminine, and it's believable. It becomes funny when you get an older person, like maybe the nurse in Romeo and Juliet. And then that becomes what we might associate with sort of Panto Dame, or Mark Rylance doing the 12th Night Olivia. It's very unlikely that Olivia would have been played by anyone older than the age of 19. Right. So audiences at the time just took boys for women. It just was not a concern for them. They just didn't think about the fact that, oh, that's not believable.
Yeah, I've noticed that in all the sort of contemporary, when people in their diaries, whatever, talk about characters on the stage, they always refer to them as, her, if it was a female character,
Yeah,
right? So
you're probably thinking of Henry Jackson's
yeah,
at Oxford, his
yes, of Desdemona.
Desdemona.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Gosh, it's amazing, isn't it?
We're going to go to questions in a few minutes, but I have to ask a question about your other book on the hand on the stage, which is absolutely fascinating because it's not something we think about a lot. And you talk about the hand as an indicator of human agency, of emotion, and social and personal identity. And I've always been struck, of course, in so many places, people swear by their hands.
Yes.
Right, by these pickers and stealers, says
Yeah.
Hamlet. Right,
Yeah.
why? What? Or could you explain for the audience, what is it about the hand? Why would you swear by the hand?
Sure. Well, my first book was thinking very much about the face
Mm-hmm.
and the stories that faces tell. And then, because I was looking at a lot of cosmetic recipes from the time, they would always tell women to use the makeup on their face and then on their hands. So I thought, I'm really intrigued by this. And of course, when you think about clothing from the 16th and 17th centuries, the only thing you could see were people's faces and their hands.
Mm.
Right nowadays, and depending on the period, sometimes the neck would be lower for women, et cetera. But mostly it's the face and the hands. And so the face and the hands become spaces of scrutiny. And in Shakespeare's time, they were such a vertical society that they cared very much about boundaries and definitions. And they want to be able to identify who you are, what your background is, what your story is, just upon meeting you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Which is why they had sumptuary laws telling
Mm-hmm.
people what they could wear and what they couldn't wear.
Mm-hmm.
And so the hand becomes a really important place for thinking about where you're from and who you are, right? So you have a lot of moments in Shakespeare where people who are more rustic or shepherds, for example, their hands are darker. They have they're tanned.
Mm-hmm.
They're rough. Sometimes you see references to rough hands. And so that's also becomes an indication of class, which is a really important identity marker in Shakespeare's time. And women's hands, there was an ideal, just like there was an ideal for the face, there was an ideal for the hands. If you look at the portraits of Queen Elizabeth I,
Mm-hmm.
those that show her hands, you'll see really unfeasibly long fingers,
Mm-hmm.
really slender, long fingers,
Mm-hmm.
which is a sign of virtue, but it's also becomes, and they're very pale as well.
Yeah.
But it also becomes a kind of symbol of her wealth and her status, right?
Mm.
Like those hands have never done any work,
No.
right? So that I became really interested in that, and also the art of physiognomy was the art of reading the face. When Duncan talks about the mind's construction in the face, but there was also the art of chiromancy, which is palm reading.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the early Middle Ages and the 16th century, chiromancy was seen as a scientific, artistic endeavor. It was not a con job, as it becomes much, much later.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were all these books that show the hand and the sort of alignment of astrology with the hand and the palm, and how those can be read and studied. And it would tell you about your character. It wouldn't just tell you about the future, but it would tell you about who you are, what kind of person you are. So that was really the main reason I became fascinated with it, because when you start looking at Shakespeare's work, you find actually the word hand shows up a lot.
Thank you. Now we're going to go, Mary is going to come back and she's going to give us some questions from our viewers. Hey, Mary.
Hello, hello. And I've had to use these. They're building a house next door and it's very loud. So my apologies.
No problem.
As we give folks a chance to get their questions in, I have one in the meantime.
Sure.
And I'm really interested, Farah, from your very personal perspective, personal experience, what are some of the elements about the architecture at the Globe that you find most exciting, most compelling, either from the perspective as you're in the audience or as the actors are doing their work?
Sure. Well, I mean, gosh, I chair the architecture research group, so I should be able to answer this question quite easily. I suppose the yard itself, because it creates a really different kind of experience. I often describe it as a mosh pit to my students, because some of my students will have been in a mosh pit, and I don't know if those are still a thing, but they were.
Yes, they are. They are.
Well, that's how I describe it. You know, when everybody, certainly in Shakespeare's time, you can imagine that they were all kind of pushed up against each other, and that makes the experience not just about sound and sight. It becomes about tactility as well. And so I've written a lot about the sort of multisensory nature of Shakespearean theater. That, you know, in Shakespeare's time, they were very attuned to their senses. The senses were the portals of knowledge.
Mhm.
And sometimes we don't think about the senses. We just kind of go about our business, and, you know, but that is how we take knowledge in. It's through the senses. And so certainly if you read anti-theatrical literature of the time, it tells you that this is a very dangerous space for you sensorially, because theater can push into the body and it can harm you and corrupt your soul and change your very nature. And that becomes, that's the exciting part of the Globe, is because it brings all of that to life. It's so visceral. And I think the yard and the fact that people can see each other is what makes that, what actually lends to that dynamic.
Amazing. So I'm going to keep asking questions until more come in. I love what you were talking about with the two Shakespeares, the sort of the bardic figure that emerged in the 18th century. And then I imagine so much of what, you know, the 19th century was all about, like, you know, just made that even more so. So I'm curious. I've always been curious about, is it possible even for us to identify those elements of early modern Shakespeare, the early modern period, Shakespeare in that context, that's actually far more similar to our sensibilities or our values or our aesthetics now? Like, if we didn't have all of that stuff in the middle. Does that make sense, my question?
It does, yeah. I think that's a really difficult question. I suppose what I'm thinking about in my book, because I have a chapter on how the 18th century just took Shakespeare and separated him from his works, kind of. And we lost the idea of Shakespeare as being this kind of jobbing playwright who, you know, had like ink stains in his hands and was, you know, in Southwark most of the time, which at that time was not the best area of London. It was a manufacturing part of London. It was where all the playhouses, the brothels, the cockpit, the bear baiting arenas were. And Shakespeare was moving around those spaces, right? That's not the 18th century Shakespeare. He's wearing a puffy shirt and with his quill, you know, in some attic somewhere writing, right? Mm-hmm. So going back to Shakespeare's original conditions of playing does take you to a Shakespeare that feels more familiar now in terms of, you know, the contemporary writer, right? If we can think of Shakespeare as a contemporary writer and think of these plays as brand new, then that will take us into all kinds of exciting places. Because if we think of them as these legacies that we've inherited, then it becomes a burden. And that's what makes some people just go, I don't want to do this. I don't want to study this.
Well, thank you. Jillian would like to know, she says, one of the sonnets starts, "My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun," and goes on to debunk all the romantic conventions. Comment? What does it tell us?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of my favorite sonnets. I tell often my students that, you know, Shakespeare liked brown girls. I'm a brown girl, Pakistani. And yeah, I think that what that sonnet is doing, and what the series of sonnets, which are addressed to a dark lady, are doing, is kind of, I suppose, taking apart some of the conventions that a lot of his contemporaries were engaged in, right? So if you think about the blazon, which is a sonnet style that came from the anatomical blazons that came from France, and also Petrarch, that date back to Petrarch, which is where they take a woman and they almost dissect her and they talk about her eyes, and they talk about her mouth, and they talk about her breast, and they talk about her hands. And before you know it, she's not a whole person anymore. And also she's been compared to all of these elaborate things, you know. And so that's why Shakespeare starts in the negative. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. You know, that would be really painful to stare at her, because you can't look directly at the sun. It would blind you, right? So he's being very pragmatic about beauty. And he's saying, actually, my mistress doesn't have breath that smells like perfume. It's just normal breath. And she doesn't look like a goddess when she walks. She just looks like a woman. And actually, as a woman I really like to get together with from time to time, you know, essentially. And he, I think what he's doing is saying, this is not the only ideal of beauty. And he didn't really appreciate, it seems to me, I don't have a direct line to Shakespeare, but it seems to me that he didn't appreciate a bunch of other people telling him what was beautiful and what was desirable, because desire is subjective.
And the last line, you know, I think as rare as any she belied by false compare. So you've got set this standard up, and it's a bunch of nonsense. So no, let's wipe the slate clean. And like you say, she's an individual, not to be plugged into some sort of preconceived poetic notion of beauty, which is really interesting. Yeah.
Artificiality. And actually, if you're constantly idealizing a woman, when you meet a real one, you know, what are you going to do with that? Right? It's like Shakespeare saying, you're not going to know what to do with this.
Which is makes Shakespeare even more relevant now. We're talking about those TikTok videos where you have all these, very often these young women doing these, you know, trying to be this aesthetic ideal, which no one can live up to. It's in some ways it's very, very sad. And so Shakespeare, 400 years ago, 450 years ago, is already arguing against that sort of thing.
Exactly. My students and I, we talk about that sometimes. We talk about filters, you know, the filters you have on your phones and Snapchat filters and things that can take away all your wrinkles or change, you know, the structure, your bone structure, all of those things, when actually those filters have been around for centuries, right? So we know that, you know, magazines in the 80s and 90s were airbrushing. And we also know that in Shakespeare's time, those kinds of sonnets and poems that made women into this thing that they couldn't possibly ever be, that was another form of airbrushing. It's another filter. And so you don't get to the real human being until you remove those filters. And that was as true then as it is now.
Wow. One of the things we want to make sure everyone knows about is your Gresham lecture next month. Can you tell us about that, Farah?
Sure. So I'm giving one of the Gresham annual lectures, Gresham College in London, and it's going to be streamed from the Museum of London where the lecture is taking place. Yeah, they asked me to come and talk about Shakespeare, race, and performance. So I'm in the process of writing that lecture right now. And it might be, there'll be some stuff about the culture wars and about performance at the Globe.
Wonderful. And it is free and it's really easy to register. I have already done so and I'm really looking forward to it. We have time for one more question. This is from Penny, who says, Canada has many newcomer communities and immigrants bring with them a rich culture. What is the relationship of the Globe with these communities in Britain? Are there any reciprocal relationships?
That's a really great question. So one of the problems that the Globe has had over the years is how to, I suppose, move between the demographic of audience that we've had and trying to invite new audience to come and engage with our work. Partly it's because Shakespeare is perceived as a barrier in a lot of communities. And that could be down to the way he was taught in schools for some of those communities, or that his language feels impenetrable. And the Globe feels like this big space of, you know, iconic space of white excellence that actually does might make people feel, actually, that's not for me. I like contemporary theater. I want to do that. I like post-colonial theater, that kind of thing. When we did the Globe to Globe Festival in 2012, one of the really extraordinary things that our marketing department did at the time was to reach out to London's language communities, because there are hundreds of different languages spoken in London. And that has been the case for many, many years. So we knew we were going to be doing a Bengali production. We knew we were going to be doing a Pakistani production in Urdu. We knew we were going to be doing a production in Italian, and all of those different countries. So we reached out to those language communities and marketed hard there. And what was really amazing was that to see those audiences come in and how the audience would change when the production changed. I remember being a Pakistani American, the day we did The Taming of the Shrew, which was with a company from Pakistan, and they did it all in Urdu. And that evening, everybody that came into the theater looked like me. I was like, wow, like I'd never been around that many Pakistani, because I'd never, I was born there, but I didn't go back there. And that was so amazing. It was such an extraordinary feeling of being at home and being at home, because the Globe felt like a home to me. And I felt like I was part of something that my colleagues couldn't, they didn't understand what was funny. And I was like, oh my God, that's hilarious. And I was laughing at certain moments in the production. So yeah, there are ways to reach out to those communities, and we've done that in the past.
Wow, thank you so much. We're going to have to wrap it up for today, but before we close out, I'd love to encourage everyone to join us for the final webinar of the Bard Explored series on October 2nd, when Paul will be in conversation with Paul Yachnin of McGill University in Montreal. Also, if you haven't yet had a chance to see Done Undone by Kate Besworth, you have a bit more time. Availability for on-demand viewing has been extended to the end of October. Finally, I'd love to welcome you all to our fall series of Speech of the Week. This free program is open to all ages and all experience levels, and it's entirely adaptable to every individual's interests and needs, with opportunities to just watch and listen, to discuss and share ideas, or even to perform the speech in your own way. We start on Monday, when I'll be in conversation with the wonderful actor Harveen Sandhu about the speech from Hamlet in which Polonius gives Laertes advice. And Ava, the magnificent Ava, has put links in the side here for everything that we've talked about, so it's easy for you to find everything. Oh, huge thank you to you, Farah, and to you, Paul, to you, Ava, and to Scott, and to everyone who's joined us for this conversation today. Thank you all so much. And until next time, farewell.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.